So one of them cost us $1,000 based on, hey, he's got some skill. I think we can develop some physical features to improve that talent base, where the other guy had really good talent. Man, the only thing we can do is develop skill. That talent's got to go somewhere. Talent has a shelf life. Skill's going to be around is a kind of a easy way I like to look at it. And those are the guys you gotta really hope they get enough game reps, which you can't guarantee.
Hey, this is More Than Velocity. I'm Bart Pear here with Ryan Croton and Jordan Oseguera, and today we're talking about scouts, pro scouts, college scouts. What do they want to see in a player? What are they looking for to give you money, to give you scholarships, those type of things? We've kind of mentioned this a little bit in some of our quick pitches, but we wanted to get a little more detail and cover the topic a little better, especially around the pro scout. What are they looking for high school athletes, college athletes as well? So let's get started. Ryan, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I can just explain kind of from my perspective. I was responsible for looking at athleticism, and then I also collaborated with Jordan on evaluating biomechanics and really determining what type of movements are, very trainable in an athlete, and then what's their raw characteristics. So looking at their core function, how well they can jump, so their lower body power, their acceleration capacity as a pitcher, and I also looked at questionnaire data. So some of the athletes that are out there that are being asked questions by major league teams, they really need to think hard about what they're putting down there to represent, things like their habits, their preparation. All of those things are key elements that at least I looked at to consider an athlete's future performance. So, and I can get into those details, later, but I'll let Jordan kind of communicate, his background.
Obviously did a lot of work with Ryan through the draft, just like he pointed out there, and communicating with scouts and, different things like that. One of my main duties was kind of overlooking the biomechanics of those guys from a coaching lens. What Ryan was talking about there, what's fixable, what's not fixable. What is the easiest fix in this athlete, and what do we really want to improve with them, as well as monitoring those pitch movement shapes, kind of those predictive statistics that some people paying attention to the right things of how the player's performing.
Cool. Why don't we start with something we touched on before, and that's, and obviously this is where the name of the podcast comes from. It's More Than Velocity. Let's talk about some of those other things, like doing the basics better. Let's elaborate there, Jordan.
So from a scouting standpoint of it, it's definitely more than velocity. 100% of those early rounders, they're going to be thrown with some velocity when it comes down to it. But you start seeing these guys, especially later on in the draft, rounds 10 and on. Obviously, they've changed the structure this year to where you see, well, that kid was throwing 86 in high school. Why did they sign him in the 15th round? Well, he was doing things that projected that the velocity will show up. And then he does some of those things that organization specifically may go, well, we don't teach these aspects well, but we know we can get this guy throwing harder. So we're going to take the things that, the more than velocity aspect of it, to where maybe we don't teach curveballs real well, but this guy really spins a breaking ball, and we know we can add that velo to it. So they're looking at what they know they can develop, and they're building that in with what that player's tool set already is. I don't know if I answered the question. I'm trying to get as direct on it as I can without being overly broad or overly specific for the purpose of it.
Well, I mean, I know we talked about before, and not just pitchers, but just covering your area. If you're fielding and doing the basics better, just making sure that it's not the it's not the ESPN Sports Center highlights that you guys are recruiting for. It's the stuff you can count on.
Yeah. So that goes into another whole realm of, when you're looking at those players, you look at skill versus talent a lot of those times. And skill is just your ability to perform consistently at what your task is. So if you're a shortstop, that's handling that 3 to 5 step range around you. If you're a pitcher, skill is your ability to locate, 3 pitches or 4 pitches to both sides of the plate, maybe top and bottom of the zone as well, depending on what that skill set is. So the better you can perform those basics, the more you're going to be able to fit an organizational structure better. Most of the time, those guys that are going early are really highly skilled and highly talented. As you get further on into the draft, you might have guys that are high skill where they're hoping, hey, maybe we can fix, and this is where Ryan came in a lot, maybe we can fix or improve some type of physical characteristic to enhance that skill with some extra velo or extra exit velocity or more sprint speed, whatever that may be. Or maybe it's a guy who has a whole lot of talent tool base, and now we got to teach him some type of skill. So those are some of the cool things that go along with that in terms of doing basic better. Is the better someone does the basics, it's easy to build around that guy.
On the training side of things, when I look at just starting from scratch and looking at the questionnaires, I evaluate how are they preparing themselves. So, for example, some pitchers may not have a solid dynamic warm-up when asked to, list the certain aspects that they require in preparing for a game. Sometimes athletes aren't using any kind of loaded activity using bands or plyocare balls to potentiate or get the throwing arm primed. And so it's, some of those things, if they have, great skill and they're missing some of these basics, I can forecast what they do really well. And, with our encouragement and our education, what could be the potential ceiling with things like that? Their training age is also important. Do they have a basic level of fitness? Sometimes you'll get a college guy who has, a very long history of training. Sometimes I've seen some that have had 10 years of a training age. They've been training for 10 years and they're unable to jump more than 27 inches, and they're already, 215 pounds, and they're a large athlete. So they're getting close to their genetic limits. So that makes things a little more challenging. So sometimes, if the athlete has a certain grasp of training, we can expand upon it. And for the listeners that are out there, that the young athletes that have young athletes that don't have a great training age, maybe they've only been training for a couple of years, that's also great too, because again, that allows us as a staff to know in our system, we can expand these training qualities for them. We can put 20 pounds on this athlete that is going to translate into velocity. Lean mass development is a huge component, but we have to also see, what's this athlete's nutrition habits like? And they, in our questionnaire when I was with the Angels, we asked, certain questions about those habits, and it allowed us to factor in, what can be done with this athlete and how far can they go.
So yeah, that goes along the lines of durability and obviously you're projecting potential performance, but a lot of that is also around endurance and the increased workloads of taking a step to the next level. And how do you evaluate, can they handle what a professional baseball player needs to be able to handle day in and day out? What are you guys doing to evaluate that?
Yeah, I mean, usually what happens is the scouts, in particular, they'll be taking game logs and they'll be, evaluating their velocity to see if it sustains. You get some different guys. I know even at the pro level, when we look at certain players, they would start out throwing really hard, and then, after about 60 pitches, it would start to come down. And then you see some other players that start out really, really light on their velocity, and it escalates further in the games. But for those components, we really have to rely on the scouting details. And thinking of our app, when I've seen the beginnings of our app before I entered the company, I thought about how could our app advance the scouting component. And I really think that it should be a part of a team's internal draft camp battery where they can evaluate the strength features of the athlete and understand, does this athlete have the requisite strength to be endured? You know, so I think the game is going to go along to a more objective means of evaluating strength, but right now it's been mostly from velocity records.
Yeah, and on my end, I would look a lot at obviously those movement characteristics. If we're looking at a starting pitcher, I want to know how they maintain their biomechanics from pitch one to whatever that last pitch is. And then I want to know if is there variation from, outing to outing or month to month. And you can go a really deep dive on that depending on where you're valuing that player at in the draft, obviously. And then from there, a lot of those major schools now are getting TrackMan units. They're getting those things to where you can go deeper into that information. And yeah, there's going to be calibration errors. I know people are going to be talking about the calibration errors from this school to that school, but you're going to be able to see consistencies if you're pulling from those same, home games that you're getting data from. And all of a sudden you can see in innings 1 through 3, he's maintaining X velo and X pitch shape. All of a sudden it drops off in innings 4 and 5, but then anytime he gets into the 6th or the 7th or the 8th and he's pitching deeper, sometimes they uptick. And those are the guys you really start to go, okay, there's something here where this guy's getting that, whatever, the second wind or whatever you want to call it, that's being shown over that large sample. And, that's why we like this.
Yeah,
Or there's a guy. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
go ahead. You go ahead. Sorry, cut you off.
But the other thing I was going to say is you also have the other guys that, well, why does he take until the third inning to get cooking? Why is it that all of a sudden, like, even if he's maintaining his velo, say this guy's 92.7 on the fastball and 84.6 on a slider and, 83 on a changeup. We're just throwing some random numbers out. But let's say all of a sudden he adds on an inch and a half of induced in the third inning for the fastball, adds 2 inches of depth to the slider, or 2 inches of sweep to the slider, and then all of a sudden he's getting more horizontal on the changeup in the third inning. Like, what was the difference? That's a consistent factor for that guy. So now we can start digging into that on the fine level. Kind of, I always talk, I like the 30,000 foot view, and then once you get that 30,000 foot view, you go, that's where I need to start diving in more. I think there's gold there, and then you can start digging into those areas, and then you get with your performance staff. And you go, hey, guy with the PhD, help me figure this out as to why he's changing these things. What's different from a strength standpoint? What's different from the endurance standpoint? And how do we train this to now, instead of it being innings 1 through 3 and then 7 and 8, how do we do this to make it 1 all the way through inning 8?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing in terms of what's available in scouting now. There are a lot of teams that have a predictive engine where a lot of data goes in and it spits out a rating for a particular athlete. But one of the things I really enjoyed working with Jordan is meticulous about digitizing movement. So in the world of biomechanics, it's kind of an old school method to identify where joints are and measure angles at certain points in the delivery. And so one of the things, because I didn't have a good understanding of strength based on the measurements that we had taken, and we had great speed ideas with our testing, and lower body power with various jump tests, and core function with various med ball tests, but we didn't have any indication of strength. And one of the things that Jordan would measure would be the lead knee flexion. And a lot of the athletes that we realized, might not have the great endurance data in terms of sustaining velocity, but when you looked at their biomechanics, you would see that from foot contact to ball release, their knees would actually start to flex. Some of them not as pronounced as others, but we would be able to see, does this athlete post or have a great lead leg block? So meaning that the leg is in further extension. It doesn't have a huge amount of range of motion change, so it's really stable when you're measuring these things. But it definitely doesn't flex, because if you're starting to see a lot of flexion in a pitching delivery, there's some strength issues there. So that was one thing that I'd like to tell the audience that we have, is that lower body strength. There are people looking at these things. Biomechanics is getting even greater. It's getting more portable, easier to evaluate. So, getting a basis of training in that particular feature could really affect your future outlook, as far as having someone like myself who evaluates movement, and athleticism, and it's happening. The game also has something called the MLB PDP pipeline, the player development pipeline that developed a whole bunch of battery of tests now. So there's a combine. This is becoming a brand new thing in Major League Baseball, but we've been doing this for a while. So the baseball players out there, you got to become an athlete. Being an athlete is really important, and it does show up in your movement properties.
Yeah, and just to give some real world examples to that, and these are things that, Ryan, you were there for those. I remember we had a guy come through. It was in the third round, a high school kid. He was 17 at the time, obviously draft eligible. And there was a specific asking price. And, I went through this guy's delivery. You went through it. We looked through the strength numbers. We had him at all of our stuff. He we didn't really expect him to get much better, and for that asking price of what a high school kid wanted in that round, wasn't really a good thought or an investment. And I remember we passed on him, and everyone was going like, "Oh my gosh, like this kid's really good." I won't use names. All of a sudden, he signs with X team in Arizona, has a great first year. All of a sudden, that second year, he goes back. He's velo's down, command's down. And that was the other thing too, is like we think this guy's at the pinnacle of where he's going to be. And you're not always going to be right. We ended up being right on this one. His performance regressed. So he was, 96, 98. All of a sudden he's, 90, 94, 96. Then he's 92, 94. And now he's, last I saw, he's, sitting in that low 90 range, high 80s, low 90s right in there. And all the stuff's regressing, not as many strikes. And then on the other hand, we had a guy we took, this was in the 36th round, 37th round, somewhere in there. And I remember getting scouts texting me from other organizations going, I don't even understand this in the 36th, 37th round. Like, what are you guys doing? Like, there's guys that are more projectable. He's pitching in the big leagues right now, and he's doing really well. And he's, occasionally hitting 100 miles an hour. And we signed him at 88 to 92 as a senior in college. So, there's things that we're looking at. Those are those mechanical tells that
well, let's get into some specifics if you can. I mean, why did you think that one guy peaked and lacked potential there, and why was this other guy, you're essentially saying, a diamond in the rough? He had a lot more potential.
Yeah. So from the peaked standpoint is you're looking at this guy, I think his body fat was like 8.5%, which is, for a baseball player, extremely good.
Yeah,
6'4", 6'5". Man, I think he was like 225. He was a large human being, to say the least. Like put together really well. High velo, fantastic mechanics. The jump measures we had on him were better than a lot of the guys we had in the big leagues. His sprint measures, there was everything on here was like, wow, this is like as good as we could. If you're gonna go to MLB, PlayStation, what is it, the show or something like that, and create a player, like that's your create a player. But in the real world, it's like some people are early blossomers, and this guy was probably just he bloomed early. Like the risk of him, like unless he's getting to the big leagues tomorrow, which talent-wise, kid could go pitch in the big leagues. Skill-wise, he was not ready. And that's where we get into what we're looking at in that scouting side. Your first rounders, talent and skill match up. Those guys get to the big leagues really quick. You're banking on that guy ready to go as quickly as possible. On the other end of it, you don't want to invest that big money into a guy who's got huge talent, low skill. You can save a little bit there. But then the other guy we're looking at, what we saw was he understood what he was doing between the lines. Like he was trying to throw split fingers at the right time. He was trying to use his pitches at the right time, but he had some strength imbalances where he would land. You'd see a little bit of instability in that lower half. Occasionally he'd flash some really good stuff with that delivery, but you could just look at it and go, man, this guy, like, we don't need to add weight to him. We'd have to add strength. There's been something that he's been doing that hasn't been good enough to balance out his body, to utilize a consistent movement pattern. He was with us in rookie ball. All of a sudden, he starts going from 88, 92 to, he starts topping at 94, 95 on occasion. And then he comes back, he buys into the system, he does everything the performance staff asks. We didn't need to do anything on a pitching side of it. we knew the movement qualities were there. We just needed the consistency and the strength to repeat that. Next thing you know, he comes back. He's pitching in low A, dominating out of the starting role, cuts up to high A almost instantly, gets to double A that year, finishes in double A, has to go back and repeat level, gets to triple A, and he's pitched in the big leagues for 2 or 3 organizations now. And I think he was $1,000 is what his draft price ticket was, to where if we would have taken that other guy who hasn't gotten out of, I think it's either high or double A at this point, and it's been 4 years later, that would have cost us, in at least in the 6-figure, almost 7-figure range for that particular player. So one of them cost us 1,000 based on, hey, he's got some skill. I think we can develop some physical features to improve that talent base. Where the other guy had really good talent, man, the only thing we can do is develop skill. That talent's got to go somewhere. Talent has a shelf life. Skill's going to be around is a kind of a easy way I like to look at it. And those are the guys you gotta really hope they get enough game reps, which you can't guarantee, but you can guarantee you're going to get reps on the sprints. You can guarantee you're going to get reps on the squat rack. You're going to get reps on whatever those things where you're push pow off presses. You can tell I love the weight room. But you can guarantee that stuff. You can't guarantee the guy's going to be able to get between the lines.
So
Yeah.
go ahead. Ryan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, some other things because you asked for some other specifics. One of the things that I would see in a very projectable athlete, and I actually want to give credit to Jordan because we didn't have a 3D motion capture system, but high speed camera, so slow motion video, when you watch rotation, a lot of these real high level performers in future, they know how to decelerate. A lot of athletes can accelerate themselves. They have great rotational speed towards home plate, but the whole key between the really good pitchers and elite pitchers is they know how to stop. Their pelvis they have great braking capacity. They can stop at the right time and they sequence well, and their energy doesn't over rotate. They're really on line with the plate, and that's something you can see from the head-on camera angle, and that's important in scouting and coaching that are out there. Coaches are out there, even parents, if they're taking video of their kids pitching, you need to have a few different perspectives and give it to someone who's high quality, because the things that the coach may be seeing are the things that the scouts are going to definitely see. You got in that draft room, at least we had a big crew. I think we probably had about 100 people in there, scouts from all over the country, performance specialists, analysts, obviously the front office, big draft board, people making notes on all the guys, giving certain symbols of, I would go in, put on who would be a plus athlete in the draft. Particularly in the later rounds, we'd find some guys that we thought were more coachable, that had the physical resources. So I think it's important too to really understand your movement as an athlete. And some of the young kids, they might not really have been seeing video of themselves, So I think that's an important component too to evaluating and improving your projectability as an athlete. And just on another side, I always get the question, like, should you take a high school pitcher in the first round or a college pitcher in the first round? It kind of depends on the team, but Jordan and I are doing some research right now, and we've seen in the most recent draft to have guys enter the major league. So we took data from 2005 to 2015 that now it's at least 7 years that there should be some guys in the big leagues from that draft. It doesn't really matter in the early rounds for the WAR rating, which is the wins above replacement. It's the metric that people use to evaluate talent at the big league level. That it doesn't really matter. So some of these people out here, like we need to understand the movement qualities, the physical qualities. I think those things, rather than looking at the education level, whether it's a 4-year athlete, a junior college, or a high school, is going to matter. So we got to take care of it. You got to definitely know how you're moving, talk to coaches, and train.
You can feel free to just tell me that I'm obviously completely wrong here. But there's always this. It's every single person. You hear it all the time. You never take a high school pitcher as you're in the first round. You never do it. Why? That guy told me so.
Yep.
Well, what do you mean that guy told you so? Well, he's been in the game for 35 years. Okay, so there's plenty of teams that have taken a high school pitcher with the first pick that have done pretty well. And there's also plenty that have done poorly. And instead of just looking at this in a vacuum of, well, that pick correlates to that, there's so much that goes into it. Well, what was the development strategy? Where was this player at in terms of skill and understanding what were his lifestyle factors? Was this player really bought into playing baseball? There's so many things that go into it that it almost turns into this anecdotal, people are just like relying on, throwing the dice and going like, man, if I roll a 7 or higher, I'm taking the guy, in the sense is the way that it almost sounds like. I know that's not what's going on. But there's too much anecdote going on with it. And that's the big question I think people need to ask is, why is it better to pass on that same high school player, and then after he graduates, I'll just throw a school out there because a lot of guys pass on him, and then once he graduates, he gets through his senior or junior year at Vanderbilt, now we'll pay him a ton of money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things like, why was that a safe bet now all of a sudden that we have 3 years of hindsight, but now we're going to pay more than we would have if we would have just drafted him in the 10th round? So why is it that the college system is the safer bet for quote unquote developing the guy as opposed to rookie ball? I don't know if you have any insights on that,
Yeah.
or
I mean, yeah,
am I
you know,
crazy? Tell me if I'm crazy with what did I make any sense there? I
no,
was just rambling.
it's a confusing aspect about the draft, and for me, I always think about how do we get a player to develop professional habits. I'm not saying that doesn't happen in college. I'm sure it does. But getting them inside the walls of a professional team and understanding the rigors of professional baseball, and they're being paid to play. And the other thing is that major league teams, they're even more strict than little league when it comes to pitch counts and workload. The management of the player is a lot more stringent, and there's an opportunity to keep the athlete healthier longer. And I find the young athlete, they're very mobile by comparison to a college player. The college player are sometimes guys that they don't have the range of motion or flexibility, and you're working a lot harder to restore those features. Where the high school player at times can be incredibly moldable, and sometimes you get a college player, who might be an early rounder, and you stay away from them a little bit to see what is their habits and what do they do. You don't really want to get too involved in making changes, especially right away in the beginnings of their career in professional baseball. And that also happens with a high school player, but I always find, in my experience, the high school player is very eager to adjust. They take information a little bit easier, and they're adaptable. So, it's a really weird thing for me, how people view the 4-year college pitcher or the high school pitcher, as far as in the early draft rounds.
Do you think it's fair to say everyone goes, oh man, that was just a bad draft pick? That high school pitcher didn't make it. It's just a bad draft pick. So he gets paid, 7 figures. And you're telling me that this pitcher pulled the wool over the owner's eyes. He pulled the wool over the GM's eyes, over the assistant GM, over the president of baseball operations, over the scouting director, over the area scout, over the regional scout, over the international scout, over the performance scientist, over the analytics department. This guy's just, secret agent and just fooled everyone. Or do you think it's more realistic to go, maybe we need to evaluate our development practices?
Yeah.
Why did this player not matriculate? Because there's no way that he just pulled the wool over MLB Pipeline's eyes, over, perfect game evaluations eyes, over every single person who went and watched this guy play and like, man, he's fantastic. And then he gets into pro ball and it's like, it's just a bad draft pick. Instead of going, hey, where can we take some ownership in this and say, how do we need to improve as developers?
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head that I think doesn't happen as often, but it's starting to, is that the player development staff are also becoming more involved in the draft process. So I really think good teams, they have to know who they are. So for instance, one of the things that I would do is I would audit our strength and conditioning programs because I was directing them. I would want to know what are we good at? What are we not good at? How slow are the gains to be made in certain athletic features? And then I would be able to determine, if an athlete didn't have certain qualities, but were really good at coaching, and they might not have quite the skill side, but people like the player, we would know that this is somebody we could have success with, and I think on the pitching side, like if you don't develop breaking balls well, and you're really good at developing the heater, and getting induced vertical break and the things that you need for them to be successful, like I think you would be wanting to find some pitchers, that have good breaking balls because that's something that you might not necessarily teach well, but you can advance their velocity. So you really have to do an audit of who you are, I think, on the player development side, and they have to talk to the scouts.
There are a few organizations that do that, and I have some buddies that work with those organizations, and that's the big thing. Is they said is they go, this is what we know we have a good handle on coaching. So we're going to draft guys that we don't. Just as an example, say we don't teach fastballs well. We're going to draft guys that throw hard and can ride a fastball, but
Hmm.
we know we can teach a changeup. So we're going to get really good fastballs. We're going to get really good breaking balls, and we'll teach this guy a changeup. And that's how they do it. And you see the success of these particular organizations in terms of generating internal starting pitching or internal relievers, whatever their model is. There's no wrong answer for that. I personally like starters, but there's no wrong answer. And they're really good at what they do because they know what they're bad at. And I
Hmm.
think where you run into issues is a lot of people, and I think this is just the culture in general. No one wants to be told what they're bad at. Everyone wants to know what they're good at.
Hmm.
So unless you really know what it is you need help with, you can't go get that help.
Yeah, I think too for players. I mean, this is great that we're talking about this. This is called like the humility process.
It's
You know,
insight.
yeah, and being able to be a good self evaluator. I mean, we give with our platform, we give data to tell you where you are. You're ranked according to your age level and competitive level, to see where you're at. But you need that feedback. You can't be blind to not knowing where you need to improve upon. You need to have a strength weaknesses
Mhm.
analysis, and sometimes if you focus too much on the weakness, you start to lessen the effectiveness of your strength. So it takes a really good coach to understand how to allocate time to what feature. Um, for me, for an older athlete, an MLB athlete who really is at a high level of strength. There was one particular player that I think could have played in the NFL. He was a pitcher that we worked with. He was phenomenal. But doesn't matter if he squats 650 pounds anymore, or he gets up to 1,000 and the bar's bending on his back. No, this athlete needs more elastic resources. We need to do more explosive work, lighter work, dynamic work. So you have to understand, I wasn't going to work too much in our programs on this kid's strength. His not as a pun, but like he had huge amounts of max strength that we needed to focus a little bit more on the elasticity component. How quick can he contract? How well can he jump? How well can he land and absorb? So, that those are all important things I think athletes need to understand, and coaches too. It's good for a coach to know, where are my weaknesses? Some of those coaches out there, I know I just read a study, and I'd love to be able to have another talk about it. But there are a lot of coaches that don't really have a great concept of arm care, and that's okay. They might not really know. They might be a pitching coach and they might not have done it themselves. They might not have an experience with it. They might have been given a program online that they follow. And there's resources for you. Obviously we have a resource for that, but that's important as a coach to know where are my blind spots and to be okay with it.
So, and you can educate me here. So you've talked about coaches need to know where their strengths and weaknesses are. The actual organizations need to know where their strengths and weaknesses are. It would make perfect sense that a player needs to know where their strengths and weaknesses are, and then they need to be asking the right questions of the coaches and those organizations, saying, "Can you help me with my weak areas going forward?" Correct?
Yes. Yes. I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head. And Jordan and I have talked all the time. And it's a shame sometimes in professional baseball that the data. So if you can imagine going to school and not getting a report card to know how well you are doing in math, science, geography, all these different subjects, it happens in pro ball. Sometimes we are afraid to scare the horses. That's what happens sometimes, is that there's a lot of information that's withheld from the player, so they actually may not be aware of where they rank in certain features. They might not know so much in terms of the deeper statistics that a team is taking on them, and I believe that hurts a player. I believe coaches, you want to prepare your athletes for the draft. You have to prepare them to understand data. If you're taking in, it doesn't matter what kind of data you might be taking in. We're developing a pitch chart, that will have some information for the pitchers out there, but they should be aware because this is how they're evaluated. They need to know, what do I need to do to advance. That to me it's a key component of any type of success, whether it's in business or whether it's in sport. You need to know the benchmarks. You need to know what is considered good and what is considered below average, and there has to be a plan based on those outcomes and getting the athlete to where they need to be, in my opinion.
I mean, just imagine taking a chemistry class and they said you're not allowed to use the periodic table of elements. It's
Yeah.
the same thing as like, well, this is what chemistry is, right? Yeah, it is. This is how you're evaluated, is your ability to use the periodic table of elements, but you're not allowed specifically to even see it. It's there, but you can't see it. It's like, well, how am I supposed to pass this class? And that's how a lot of it is they're worried about giving too much information. And like I said, they don't want to scare the horses. But
Yeah.
then the horses just end up confused. And, I do a lot of hunting. It's really outside of baseball, it's the next best thing that I can find to do with my time. And, I take my dog, I train my dog. And you can see if you don't give your dog enough information when you're training him, you give him a command, he doesn't know what to do. But then you can't be surprised when the dog doesn't know what to do if you didn't give him the information leading up to that. And it's the same thing with player development. It's the same thing with taking a class. You can't expect to ace the final if you haven't gotten through the midterm yet. You gotta go through the steps. Those steps are different for everyone when it comes to learning. And that's what, we need to understand is some players need more info, some players need less. Not everyone's at the same place. And if a player asks why, you should be, flattered as a coach. That player's coming to you and asking, well, why are we doing this? What does this mean? How do we get better at this? You shouldn't take it as an offense, as you're being challenged. You should take that as, hey, this guy's asking. He's making me learn as a coach as well. We should be very flattered by that.
So we spent a lot talking about the pro scout and what they want to see. How does it vary for a college scout? How does their lens when they're evaluating these players differ?
You want to jump on that first, or me, Ryan?
I mean, so my college coaching, it was very limited to being a grad assistant first base coach. So I didn't really go on the recruiting side of things, that I think Jordan would probably be, better at. But I think that the college coaching side, the college recruiting side of things is kind of challenging because, in the pro level, we're not limited by academics. And that can be a pretty key feature, I would say, in college. You got to get your athletes academically in the door, and I think as a coach, I don't know, Jordan, correct me if I'm wrong, but the NCAA, they might be taking statistics on athletic programs to see how well you graduate your athletes.
So they do, yeah.
That's
You
key.
obviously have those standards that need to be met, as well as your institution is going to give you a standard that they expect. So if your division of play has this is their like goal, your institution may want to add on 15% to that.
Yeah.
So there is graduation expectations with that as well.
Yeah. So when you think about it, I mean, obviously in pro baseball, there are evaluations, cognitive evaluations and sports psychology evaluations, but when the bottom line is like to get in the door, you just have to play well, and to advance, you have to be a great player. In college, I think there's just more to the aspect of the academic world that the athlete has to get in the door, and it's not baseball all the time. They're limited. So, in order to have a successful candidate to come into your school, in my opinion, they have to meet the expectations both on and off the field.
What about the time constraints? One, you've got players that could be gone in 2 years, so you got to get some value out of them. And two, you've got time constraints in terms of training them and developing them. So how does that change with a college scout?
So one of the ways I always like to look at it was depending on how short or long term impact that player was going to be, depending on what our commitment was going to be, is we had to have a good idea. If it's a freshman player coming in as just finished high school, they're coming in. We've given this guy money. Is we need to understand like what is this guy's expectation? If he's a starting pitcher, are we expecting him to outperform? If we have 3 returning juniors and our rotations filled up, is that really the guy we want to invest the money in, that we need to pay a ton right now of our scholarship funds, which is just discounted school? It's not actual money, obviously. Do we want to invest that fund in there that we might only have him cover 15% of our innings total for, let's just say it's 2022? If he's only going to pitch 15% of our innings in 2022, is he worth 85% of a scholarship? Or would we rather invest that into a left fielder who is going to be a transfer from a junior college or is going to be a freshman that we expect to perform in 60% of our innings? So you really need to start understanding, at the college level, you don't have a minor league system. You need to start producing now, and if you don't produce now, you need to go find another job. You don't have this whole thing of it's development over winning. Like, you need to win right away, and there's a time for development, but you got to win today. And that's where you got to start really investing and allocating your resources of how much do I expect you to contribute. Of that contribution, are you part of a winning contribution? And if you are part of that winning contribution, how much money do we really want to invest in that? So that's what you have to kind of consider. And then, depending on the transfer rules of what organization you're with and things like that, if you had a guy that was a walk-on that, we had a situation where we had a left-hander come in who, he came in, he was 75 miles an hour, but he could spin a breaking ball and he threw strikes. Told him, hey, we don't have money for you, but we have a red shirt spot. Come on, let's go. Came in, we developed him. He got into the 83 to 86 range, which for our level of play at that time was really good. And he ended up being a huge contributor after he redshirted his freshman year, came back again academically sophomore, athletically freshman still. He contributed. He was pitching our 7-inning game for us every weekend. So he was almost going complete games every time. So he went from zero money after finishing that 2 years with the school to where it's like, hey, we can contribute to this kid that we don't know about, or we know that this kid that we still have 3 years of control over, let's give him 50% of a scholarship because we have that money clearing up. They're going to invest in that. So that's the other thing too is, you need to make sure that you're rewarding those guys that are internal with you, because you want them to keep coming back and not going, well, I can still transfer to a junior college and then try to go somewhere else after. So you got to make sure you're understanding how you're valuing your internal guys compared to those external guys, because you want to make sure you're building that culture as well, which in college culture is huge. That I know this is kind of the question, but not the question, where it's a little off topic. But
That's
when
your
I would
style,
recruit
Jordan.
guys,
That's okay.
I'm all over the place. I use the shotgun approach. But I told guys, like, there's three things when it comes down to picking a school. It's got to fit your social need, your academic need, and your athletic need. If you can find two of those three things in whatever order you want to prioritize them, you're going to be at the right place. If it's not fitting two of those three things, that's not a guy you want to invest money in, and that's not a place you want to give you money. You're going to have a terrible time. Like, who goes somewhere to have a bad time,
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's my rant on that one, I guess.
All right, Ryan, you got anything else, or want to wrap this up?
No, I think we hit it, man. That was a pretty extensive player evaluation podcast.
Awesome. Well, let's call it a day. Listen, if you're
Took
listening,
it off the rails at the end, but
that was my plan, to throw it in the ditch there right at the end. So, but
way to go, Bart.
Yeah, that's my job. But honestly, if we miss something that you've got a question about in this regard or any others, please reach out to us. Through the podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, check us out there, or go over to Armcare and the support and just ask a question in the support and say, hey, it's about the podcast or it's about this, and we'll either respond to you immediately, or which is most likely, but also maybe do a podcast on your questions. So please do that. For now, thank you, and until next time.